Alrighty, happy Friday, everybody. Welcome back to Engineering Major, Philosophy Minor. EMPM is the channel where you can get a working aerospace engineer's opinions on topics pertaining to engineering, philosophy, politics, and social issues, and sometimes the combination of those four things. Now, in today's video, we are going to be talking about a combination of those four things, and it starts off with an engineering-related topic. So, unfortunately, I am sad to report that my favorite engineering periodical, Aviation Week, where I get all of my nice aviation news and space technology news, has succumbed to a little bit of wokeness. And in this video today, we're going to talk about an article that showed up on their website titled Humans to Mars Tackles Race, Inclusion, and Diversity. Now, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with race, inclusion, and diversity, except for the fact that obviously that topic is very ideologically driven, and Aviation Week, being a technology magazine, typically reports on things like new areas of research and development, cool aerospace technology, perhaps technical issues that the aerospace industry is having. Of course, in this article, you can see they're going to be talking about the new government program, which is a replacement for the MQ-9 UAV, or RPA, remotely piloted aircraft as some people call it. Anyway, very typically these are mostly technical articles. In fact, the only time politics really gets involved is if there is some basically fiscal spending decision with regards to, or basically some drama in commercial aerospace, which has been happening with Boeing as of late. So, that said, there are a few reasons why I wanted to talk about this article in particular. First off, it's yet another area of science being taken over by the radical left. They finally made it to Aviation Week, and no one would have thought that Aviation Week had a problem with race, inclusion, and diversity until this article was written, and there's a couple passages in here that may be a little bit incriminating for them. Now, I don't actually think that the periodical is racist or non-inclusive or not diverse enough, but unfortunately, when you're trying to please the mob, sometimes you accidentally end up incriminating yourself like Princeton University did recently. So we'll talk about that. Number two, and this is very important, which is the physical laws of nature do not care what race you are. Consequently, neither does engineering and neither does Mars. All right? If you're doing a calculation for F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, a very, very fundamental Newtonian law, it does not care what the race of the person is who's performing that calculation. If you are applying the laws of thermodynamics or the laws of Einsteinian relativity and gravitation, you do not need to worry about race, inclusion, and diversity in performing those calculations. You simply need to worry about whether or not you know what you're doing when you perform those calculations and whether or not you got the answer right or close enough that it keeps people safe and works. The third reason is that science should not be about race or politics, but the very fact that race, inclusion, and diversity is written on this article and is drawing all this attention is making it about race when it definitely wasn't before. In my knowledge, this is the very first article that has ever come out in Aviation Week, either in the periodical or online, to ever talk about this. And then last but not least, in terms of becoming a good engineer yourself, this type of attention being drawn, I think, tends to lead the technical community to get backed into ideological corners that ultimately inhibit making the best technical decisions or making judgments solely on the basis of technical merit and qualifications, instead focusing on other things that are not relevant to engineering, such as race, inclusion, and diversity. So let's go ahead and jump into the article before I go on and make this video too long. Many of us have been excluded or worse at some point in our lives due to skin color, gender, sexual orientation, size, religion, family, pecking order, etc. We're also, unknowingly or otherwise, part of the problem. In an effort to raise awareness of discrimination and to stem racist practices and proclivities, ExploreMars.org devoted an opening day panel of its August 31st to September 2nd Humans to Mars Summit to the topic of race, an event held virtually this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. For many of us, including staff and management of this magazine, our virtual workplaces have become a fruitful ground for new discussions about increasing diversity and combating racism. We all have skin in the game, so to speak. So I'm going to pause right there, and this is where I was talking about that first thing, which is, no one would have thought that Aviation Week had a race issue until they said these two things. We're also unknowingly or otherwise part of the problem, implying that perhaps the writer of this article has a problem with race, or perhaps the team of editors and writers for this periodical has an issue with race. And then it's saying that their own virtual workplaces are fruitful for increasing diversity and combating racism, implying that racism is possibly a problem. And then they say we all have skin in the game, so to speak, sort of making what is it, probably a well-intentioned, little joke that, everybody has skin in the game because skin color apparently is the most important thing about this periodical. Now, the one thing that I will say about this to Aviation Week and to the people watching this is I do not think that this magazine is racist. And I think it would be very difficult, even if they were, to prove whether or not they're racist. The main takeaway here is don't incriminate yourself, right? Princeton did this very badly recently. They basically, in so many words, trying to appease the narrative that there are these systemic issues in America, they basically incriminated themselves and are now under apparently federal investigation to see whether or not that's true. Now, should there be federal investigations if there is real evidence of racism? Of course there should be. But if there is not real evidence of racism, other than somebody accidentally incriminating themselves with a poorly written article or a poorly written letter, then we're just spending taxpayer money on investigations that don't lead anywhere. So let's go on. The takeaway from the H2M, that's Humans to Mars panel, moderated by Lockheed Martin's J.R. Edwards and planetary scientist Cyan Proctor with Arizona's Maricopa Community College District, the key takeaway is that our future on Mars will be determined by who we resolve to be on Earth today, notes Explore Mars President Janet Ivey. Our success and future on Mars will be determined by who we resolve to be on Earth today. And from the perspective of an engineer, what I want to do is I want to resolve to stay true to what the technical data, best engineering practices, and good engineering experience and judgment has taught me all throughout my college career and my professional career. And guess what has not ever been a part of that discussion or curriculum? Race, inclusion, and diversity. Why not? Well, because as I mentioned at the beginning, point number 2, the physical laws of nature do not care what race is utilizing them. Quote, I remember when I was in high school, I was in the car with my girlfriend, and a police officer rolled up on us, recalled panel member Leland Melvin, a former NASA astronaut and retired NFL League wide receivers. That's pretty impressive, right? This guy has been an astronaut, he's been to space, and he was in the NFL. I mean, these are probably 2 of the highest possible achievements that you could ever get in America, right? Quote, he took her out of the car and told her that I was violating her. I don't want to say this word out loud, but you can read it right here. Told her that I was violating her because he wanted me to go to jail, Melvin said. When young black men get into the prison system, they really never get out. They never have a second chance. Every father in the black community has a conversation with their son to tell them that if you get stopped by an officer, you assume the position, which is 10 and 2, hands on the wheel, you're very respectful, all these things. Yeah, I had that discussion with my dad too. That's very important. Obey officers. Don't disobey officers. When you disobey officers, bad things happen, right? Quote, I've been to space 2 times, and here is where things kind of get off the rails. Quote, I've been to space 2 times, I've ridden this rocket with millions of pounds of thrust, and not once was I afraid of going to space, Melvin says. It's when I've been stopped by officers I didn't even know that I was starting to sweat, and was holding the steering wheel really hard. People have to ensure two things, he adds. Make sure they're not part of the problem and decide what they're going to do to help, being anti-racist versus being not a racist. So, obviously, Leland Melvin is going to be a better athlete than I ever will be, and he's probably a lot smarter than I ever will be, but I just don't agree with the type of message he is sending right here. How is it possible that you could, if the whole point of this summit, this portion of the summit, is to say that there needs to be a more focus on race, inclusion, and diversity, then why would you trust the rocket that was apparently built by people who didn't have race, inclusion, and diversity in mind? Why would you trust that more than just a police officer who stopped you if you weren't breaking the law, right? And then make sure that you're not part of the problem. I think he's talking about people generally, but of course this is a technical summit, so he's talking about engineers very specifically being anti-racist versus being not a racist. I'm sorry, Leland, but I respectfully disagree. Not being racist is enough. All right. And I'll tell you a quick story about my own encounters with inclusion and diversity just throughout my engineering career. So the very first kind of UAV project that I ever worked on was actually with a black guy named Cole in community college. Now, Cole was a brilliant guy. He was super ambitious and he was very intelligent. He always got very good grades. He also was into some cool hobbies like BMX and stuff like that, and just cycling and biking. And I looked up to him a lot. I admired him, and that's exactly why I wanted to work with him on modifying one of his remote control helicopters to put a little camera on it so that he could make BMX videos. And this was before that there were fancy quadcopter drones and this was also before we had good small camera technology like you find in the iPhone and stuff like that. I mean, and I'm making myself sound super old, but if you can believe it, like 15 years ago, stuff like this didn't really exist. At least it wasn't mass produced to be inexpensive enough for you to mount it to a remote control helicopter in your spare time. So we mounted a camera on there, flew it around, took some really cool video, and race never even factored into it. And I think that if there was all this messaging around us saying that, one of us is oppressed and, the other one, it's easier for them to get through school and the other one, it's not, and blah, blah, blah. Like if it had been about anything other than just like our own intellectual merits, then if that was the force of our focus, then it probably would have been an issue simply because people were foisting it on us, though, not because it actually was a problem. And I do want to mention one other thing. I want to focus on one other thing in Leland's story. He says, when black young men get into the prison system, they really never get out. Well, as a matter of fact, Leland, I can tell you from firsthand experience, not by myself, but from one of my longest standing friends, a white guy. He got into the prison system and it was very difficult for him to get out too. So to sort of make the case that this is a problem unique to black men, I think is a little bit disingenuous. Now, maybe it happens to black men more often than it happens to white people, but I challenge you to prove that that is because of racism and not just because of other factors. I'll leave it at that. Panel member Charles Bolden, another former astronaut who served as NASA's administrator from 2009 to 2017, so that's a good position too, grew up in the segregated South of the 1950s under the specter of lynchings. That's awful. Years later, at the U.S. Naval Academy, Bolden faced another form of racism. Quote, "The assumption was because I was black that I couldn't swim," he says. "I was a competitive swimmer all my life, so I was a damn good swimmer. It was always funny because the instructors would see me get into the pool and they'd go get the shepherd's crook because they thought they were going to have to pull me out." As his career progressed, Bolden found that the higher you get in rank, the more subtle the racism and discrimination became, dogging him all the way into the NASA administrator's office. Okay, so let's just take a step back. The assumption was because I was black, I couldn't swim. Okay, is that a mean assumption to make? Yes. Is that a bigoted assumption to make? Yes. Is that a racist assumption to make? Perhaps, if they specifically said, I don't think you can swim because you're black, but it's difficult to prove. So all that stuff is bad, right? Most of the time, don't judge a book by its cover. But in this case, all that bad that was happened was he got in the pool, he demonstrated that he could swim, and that's the end of the story. So maybe there's a lot more context here, but let's pretend that this incident was a brutal, was like such a brutal form of racism, that it affected his life significantly. Well, why not talk about here how it affected your life significantly? I mean, apparently you faced all this subtle racism and discrimination, but you still made it to the NASA administrator's office and also became an astronaut. Racism is bad, right? But apparently throughout your career, it doesn't seem like it prevented you from really doing anything that you wanted to do. I think that with a lot of these stories, the focus should be on what that person did to get to that position versus what barriers were in the way. I should say, what strategies did they implement to overcome these various barriers rather than focusing on the barriers themselves, right? Let's go on. Helpfully, panel member Danielle Wood, director of the Space-Enabled Research Group at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Media Lab, provided a 2-book reading list. Home from Nnedi Okorafor, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, Spacefaring Science Fiction Series, Binti, and How to Be an Anti-Racist by Boston University's Ibram Kendi. I do actually want to read How to Be an Anti-Racist, mainly because I want to be able to learn about it and be able to talk about it intelligently. I don't want to be that guy that simply just watches, some pundit online and forms his opinions that way. But that being said, basically everything I know about how to be an anti-racist, I have learned from Ben Shapiro at this point. Now, I get it. He's a conservative-leaning guy, and he probably has his biases, but he's read quotes from the book and discussed ideas in the book. And let me just say, I want to read it for myself to really see, but this doesn't seem like a very well thought through piece of literature, in my opinion. Quote, I am a space engineer, but my goal is actually to develop research abilities to combine anti-racism with our space engineering research so that all of us could then ask ourselves, what am I doing in my job, any job you might have in the space community, anything you're designing or building or leading to be anti-racist while I do it, Wood says. It simply means asking 2 questions, she continues. Am I bringing anything from the history of racist ideas and policies in the US and repeating those in my work? And second, when I evaluate the outcomes of my work, whether it's a communication system, a hardware system, or an event, who is benefiting, and are the people from different racial groups benefiting equally? Okay, this right here is perhaps the most irritating part of the article. Okay, when an engineer is designing or building or leading a project, leading a technical project, there is nothing beneficial about diversity of skin color, and there is everything beneficial about diversity of thought, diversity of approach, diversity of ideas, right? Making sure that you have the most qualified, the most technically qualified team executing the task, all right? Let's say that I get some test data from some coupon specimens. So I take a bunch of little pieces of metal and I pull them apart until they break, and I do that on 1,000 different specimens, right? Does it matter who analyzes that data, right? Let's say that every single specimen breaks around 1,000 pounds, plus or minus 15%, right? Nothing about that number, nothing about that data has anything to do with race, diversity, or inclusion, right? This, again, goes back to the second point I made at the beginning. The physical laws of nature don't care about what race you are, all right? The data is the data. The science is the science. Now, what you do with the science may have a political and ideological component to it, for sure. But the actual people, like me, designing hardware, nothing that we do has anything to do with race. If I spend the entire time thinking about who is benefiting and whether or not different racial groups are benefiting equally in what I do, how could I ever get anything done? Right? What does that even mean? Like if I'm doing like a finite element analysis of a piece of aluminum that's machined in a weird way, what am I supposed to like go to the program manager and say, you know what, I don't really want to do this analysis unless I know that it'll get handled by like 10 different races or whatever. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Combine anti-racism with the space engineering research. I mean, it's forcing the issue of race into it. So I don't know. I just kind of think that these last two statements are a little bit ridiculous. The focus in the engineering community and the focus of those engineers who are going to be designing the hardware that will safely carry Mars astronauts to Mars, should they be thinking about race, inclusion, and diversity? No. They should be focused on the technical job that they have at hand. They should be using the best engineering judgment, the best engineering practices. They should be doing good experiment design. They should be adhering to the scientific data. And again, I can't stress this enough, the laws of nature aren't going to bend so that racial groups can benefit equally. The laws of nature are just going to be what they are, and then we as engineers utilize them and leverage them to do amazing things like send people to Mars. Now, the last thing I want to say about this video is look at all 6 of these people on this panel. They're all black, and they all made it to very high positions in their fields, right? So if they're going to try and drive the narrative that racism and exclusion and non-diversity is so bad in the US, then how did they do it? Okay, how did they make it to where they are? And this is really the ultimate message that I want to send to all you young aspiring engineers out there. If you think yourself that you are oppressed, I am sorry to hear that, and that's bad. But what you want to do is think about how these people got to where they are and what they did to overcome their circumstances, okay? Don't focus on the circumstance, focus on what you can do to overcome the circumstance. Think about who you want to be. Do you want to be this guy, Leland Melvin, NFL player, astronaut? Do you want to be Charlie Bolden, also an astronaut, director of NASA? Do you want to be Danielle Wood, this woman who obviously is in a very high position at MIT, working with NASA, working on Mars missions? Is that the person you want to be? If yes, then what you need to do is think about how you can optimize your path, how you can optimize your life so that you go along that path. And what I don't like about this article is all these people are quoting all these obstacles that they had in their way, but there's absolutely nothing in here about how they overcame those obstacles, about the attitudes that they had towards those obstacles. They're simply just espousing all these anecdotal accounts of how, they were held back, but somehow they made it. And that's the story that you want to think about, is how did they make it? It's obviously possible. If somebody doesn't think that you can swim, show them that you can swim. If somebody doesn't think that you have the technical skill set, get the technical skill set, okay? Demonstrate that you have the technical skill set. Focus on the things that you can do to overcome the obstacles. Stop focusing on the obstacles, because if you just focus on the obstacles, you'll get stuck behind them. All right, guys, so sorry for getting a little bit fired up on that, but I am super passionate about this subject, and I've been trying to film my, hashtag walk away video for a long time now. I've tried like 3 different times, and I keep messing it up. But this is a really big reason why I just couldn't stay voting for Democratic ideology and policy anymore, because it has just come in and it's just starting to take over science, and it's starting to just work its way into all these different scientific things where now literally every single aspect of science somehow has to be political, and science is just not that way. The science is just the science. So I hope you guys learned something from this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the content, and I hope you guys got inspired a little bit from that takeaway. I want to tell you right now that, if you have talent in engineering, it is well within your realm of possibilities, no matter what skin color you are, to end up in the same exact position as me or the same exact position of all these people who are here, but you do need to work hard, and you need to get your credentials, and you need to earn what you want. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and stop talking now. Otherwise, I'll just keep going for way too long. So thanks again. Leave a comment below if you agree or disagree. And peace out. Have a good evening, guys.